There are gestures that seal destinies, even when they are born of the purest compassion. Edward dug the dry earth with his bare hands. The midday sun punished his hunched back, but he did not stop. With each handful of red earth he removed, he felt the weight of the silence that hung over that forgotten place. The indigenous mother remained kneeling next to the small body, her black hair falling like curtains over her face, marked by pain. She didn't cry. He just waited, with the patience of someone who knows the true meaning of suffering. Edward's ranch was a 3-day ride from the nearest town, a place where the rules of white men were weakened in the face of the vastness of the desert. There, surrounded by reddish rocks and thorny bushes, he had built a simple life. He raised cattle, repaired fences, and watched the seasons go by with the regularity of an old clock. He never married. She never had children. Solitude was his most faithful companion, and he believed that it would remain so until his last days. But that morning, when he found the indigenous woman holding the lifeless body of her son on the edge of her property, something inside it moved. The boy should not have been more than 8 years old, too thin, too pale. The disease had won another battle against hope. Edward could have turned his back. He could have gone on, pretending he didn't see anything. It was what most men would do. It was what the times demanded. Instead, he got off his horse and knelt on the ground next to the woman. Wordless, he began to dig. She watched him with eyes that held centuries of mistrust, but also recognized the universal language of compassion. When he finished preparing the grave, he helped her to deposit the small body with the delicacy of someone who handles precious porcelain. The ceremony was silent. She muttered words in her ancestral language, while Edward remained with his head down, respecting rituals that he did not understand, but instinctively honored. When they were done, she stared at him for a long moment. Her eyes said thank you in a way that transcended languages. Then it disappeared among the rocks like a shadow, leaving only footprints in the dust and a strange feeling in Edward's chest. He returned to his daily work, but something had changed. The cattle seemed more restless. The horses neighed for no apparent reason. The wind brought different sounds, like distant echoes of drums that perhaps existed only in his imagination. All afternoon, Edward felt invisible eyes watching his every move. It wasn't paranoia. It was instinct. The same instinct that had kept him alive all those years in the wilderness. In the evening, as he prepared dinner in his modest kitchen, Edward could not get the image of his grieving mother out of his mind. There was something in his eyes that disturbed him. It wasn't just gratitude, it was something deeper, older, as if she knew consequences he couldn't yet imagine. The fireplace fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls, and Edward wondered if he had done the right thing. Outside, the desert night stretched on endlessly and silently, but he knew that somewhere, beyond the rocky hills, his action had been observed. She had been tried, and soon it would be charged. The Wild West did not forgive gestures of kindness when they crossed invisible lines that separated different worlds. Edward took out his rifle, checked the ammunition, and prepared for a long night. Tomorrow, he suspected, would be a day unlike any other. Dawn arrived loaded with omens that Edward did not know how to interpret. The birds did not sing. The cattle remained clustered in a corner of the pasture, restless, as if sniffing something in the air that the human senses could not detect. Silence weighed down the earth like a wet blanket, drowning out even the usual sound of wind among the thorny bushes. Edward left the house with the rifle in his hands, checking the surroundings with the trained eye of someone who survived decades in that hostile territory. The landscape looked the same as always. The red rocks towered towering against the blue-gray sky, and the desert stretched as far as the eye could see. But there was something different in the air, an almost palpable tension, like the one that precedes the great summer storms. As he walked towards the barn to feed the animals, Edward noticed footprints in the dust. Lots of footprints. Soft leather loafers, different from the heavy boots of white men. They circled his property like an almost perfect circle, always stopping at a respectful distance from the main house. They were not footprints of invaders. They were footprints of observers. Of silent judges who had come in the night to assess the man who had dared to cross the invisible line between two worlds. Edward's heart raced, but his hands remained steady. He knew the stories. He knew how conflicts between settlers and natives usually ended. Blood on the earth, houses burned, families torn apart. But he also knew that his situation was different. He had not taken anything from anyone. It had given it. He had helped a mother honor her dead son. If this was a crime, then the law of men had completely lost its way. Inside the barn, the horses neighed nervously. Edward approached Thunder, his black stallion, and ran his hand over his sweaty neck. The animal had known him for 10 years, but that morning he didn't seem to recognize his touch. His eyes rolled white with fear, and his flared nostrils sniffed the air for threats that Edward couldn't perceive. It was as if all of nature was on alert, preparing for something inevitable. While distributing hay to the animals, Edward noticed movement in the distant hills, dark spots that moved purposefully between the rocks. They were not animals. They were men, many men. They descended from the heights like a storm cloud, organized in formation that revealed military discipline. Edward swallowed. I had never seen so many indigenous warriors together. They were like a force of nature, ruthless and majestic. The sound of hooves pounding on dry land echoed through the valley. Edward came out of the barn and saw what his nightmares had anticipated. About 100 warriors on horseback approached his property, moving in perfect synchrony. Their war-painted faces reflected the seriousness of their mission. Spears, bows, and rifles gleamed in the morning sun. They didn't come to talk. They came to execute some kind of justice that Edward did not yet understand. He could have run. He could have ridden Thunder and galloped toward the city, seeking the protection of the army or the sheriff. But something held him in that place. Maybe it was pride. Perhaps it was the certainty that he had done the right thing. Or maybe it was simply the fatigue of a lifetime of running away from problems I hadn't created. The warriors spread out around his property, forming a perfect circle that slowly closed like a trap. Edward remained standing in front of the barn, his rifle in resting position, demonstrating that he did not intend to attack first, but also that he would not surrender easily. The silence between them was as dense as honey, loaded with meanings that transcended words. In the center of the group, an older warrior stood out. His headdress of eagle feathers identified him as the chief, and the scars on his chest told tales of ancient battles. He looked at Edward with eyes that seemed to see through his soul, weighing every action, every intention, every heartbeat. It was a silent trial, conducted according to laws older than any code written by white men. Edward waited. There was nothing left to do but wait and find out if his compassion would be rewarded or punished in that makeshift courtroom in the middle of the desert. Time seemed suspended, as if the desert itself held its breath waiting for the outcome of that impossible encounter. Edward watched the warrior chief descend from his horse with movements reminiscent of an ancestral ritual. Each step was calculated, loaded with meaning that Edward tried to decipher through the silent codes of body language. The indigenous leader approached until he was a few meters away, close enough that Edward could see the deep lines around his eyes, marks left by years of observing infinite horizons and making decisions that determined the life or death of his people. His hands, calloused by war and wisdom, did not move toward the weapons. Instead, they pointed to the direction where Edward had dug the grave the day before. A shiver ran down Edward's spine when he understood. The boy was not just a child lost in the desert. He was the son of someone important, perhaps the grandson of that boss himself, perhaps the last heir to a lineage that stretched for generations beyond the memory of white men. Edward had buried not just a child, but a piece of the soul of all those people. The chief raised his right hand, and the circle of warriors moved as a single organism. They did not advance to attack. Instead, they dismounted from their horses in perfect sync and knelt on the red earth. Their heads bowed toward the sacred spot where Edward had paid his respects. The gesture was so unexpected that Edward felt his legs weaken. For long minutes, the only sound was the whisper of the wind between the rocks. Edward remained motionless, witnessing a ritual that few white men had the privilege of witnessing. When the warriors stood up, their eyes no longer carried the harshness of war. There was something different there. Respect, recognition, maybe even gratitude. The chief moved even closer and held out his empty hands towards Edward. In his calloused palms, he offered something small, but precious. It was an amulet made of turquoise stone and silver, carved in the shape of an eagle with its wings spread. Edward recognized the symbol. It meant protection. It meant that he had been accepted, not as an invader, but as one who understood the sacred value of life and death. With trembling hands, Edward accepted the gift. The chief then placed his hand on his shoulder, a gesture that sealed a silent pact between two men from different worlds, united by the universal language of compassion. There was no need for words. Some truths were too big to fit into any language, but the moment of peace was interrupted by a sound that made Edward's blood run cold in his veins. It was the unmistakable noise of horses galloping at full speed, accompanied by the screams of angry men. A cloud of dust rose on the eastern horizon, rapidly approaching. Edward recognized the voices before he even saw the faces. It was Sheriff Macready and his detachment, probably alerted by some distant neighbor who had spotted the warriors moving toward the ranch. The Indian chief also heard the sounds, and his expression instantly hardened. He looked at Edward with eyes that now carried a silent but urgent question. Which side do you stand on when worlds collide? Edward felt the weight of that choice settling in his chest like a stone. He could shout to the soldiers, explain that he was not in danger, perhaps avoid an unnecessary massacre. But something in the boss's eyes made him hesitate. It was as if the indigenous leader was testing not only his courage, but his integrity. Edward looked around, seeing the 100 warriors who could easily decimate him, but who had chosen to honor him instead. He saw Thunder in the barn, nervous but sure. He saw his property, built with sweat and dreams, but which suddenly seemed small in the face of the moral vastness of that moment. The screams of the soldiers were approaching, and Edward knew he had only seconds to make the most important decision of his life. The amulet weighed heavily in his hand, as a reminder that some choices transcend the law of men and touch something deeper in the human soul. Edward's decision came like a flash of lightning in a dark, instinctive, and irreversible night. Instead of shouting to the soldiers, he turned to the war chief and pointed discreetly to the hills behind the barn. It was an escape route he knew well, a narrow canyon between rocks that led to a hidden valley where soldiers' horses could never follow. The chief understood immediately. His eyes lit up with something that could be surprise or approval, perhaps both. With an almost imperceptible gesture, he signaled to his warriors. Like shadows moving against the wind, they mounted their horses and began to disperse toward the escape routes that Edward had indicated. There was no unnecessary haste or panic, just the quiet discipline of men who had learned to survive in a world that didn't want them. The last warriors disappeared among the rocks, just as Sheriff Macready and his 12 men burst onto the property like a dust and metal storm. Their guns were drawn, and their faces bore the tense expression of someone who expected to find a massacre. Macready was a large man with a grey mustache and small eyes, who always seemed to look for problems where none existed. He tugged at his horse's reins with unnecessary force, causing the animal to neigh in pain, and swept the property with a suspicious look. Edward stood in front of the barn, the rifle still in resting position, trying to control the racing beating of his heart. The turquoise amulet burned in his closed hand like live coal. Macready dismounted and approached with heavy footsteps that made the earth tremble. His soldiers spread out across the property, checking every corner, every shadow, every possible hiding place. Edward knew they wouldn't find anything. The warriors had moved like smoke, leaving only a few footprints that would soon be erased by the relentless desert wind. The sheriff stopped a few feet from Edward, his small eyes studying every detail of his posture, looking for signs of lying or nervousness. Edward had dealt with Macready before. The man was known for his distrust of anything that deviated from what he considered normal, and a white man living alone on the frontier, far from civilization, certainly aroused his suspicions. Macready spat in the dust and wiped the sweat from his forehead with his dirty shirt sleeve. He pointed to the footprints around the property, some still visible despite wind efforts to erase them. Edward could see the frustration growing in the sheriff's eyes. The evidence was there, clear as daylight, but those responsible had disappeared like ghosts. For long minutes, Macready and his men searched every corner of the property. They searched the barn, the house, the corrals, even the well. They found only one man working on his land, taking care of his animals, living the simple life of a lone rancher. Nothing that justified the cavalry they had assembled to get there. Edward watched everything in silence, maintaining the neutral expression he had perfected during decades of life on the frontier. When Macready finally approached him again, there was something different in his eyes. It wasn't just frustration, it was deep suspicion, the kind that settles in a man's mind and never completely leaves. The sheriff leaned forward, his face a few inches from Edward's. His breath smelled of cheap whiskey and chewed tobacco. Edward did not back down. He had faced men worse than Macready, and some of them now rested in cemeteries scattered throughout the territory. The difference was that these men had been honest in their violent intentions. Macready finally walked away and gestured for his men to regroup. Before mounting his horse, he looked at Edward one last time, and in that look there was a silent promise. He would come back. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but it would come back. Men like Macready didn't forget when they felt cheated, even if they couldn't prove anything. After the dust kicked up by the hooves of the soldiers' horses had settled, Edward remained standing in the same place for a long time. The silence had returned to the desert, but it was different now. It was loaded with consequences that had not yet fully manifested. Edward opened his hand and looked at the turquoise amulet. He had chosen a side, and now he would have to live with the implications of that choice for the rest of his life. The days that followed brought an eerie stillness to Edward's ranch, as if the desert itself was processing the extraordinary events that had taken place on that forgotten piece of land. He continued his daily routine with the same discipline as always, but something fundamental had changed in his soul. The turquoise amulet never left his pocket, a constant reminder that he had crossed a line from which there would be no return. During the mornings, while feeding the animals, Edward often looked toward the small mound of stones that marked the grave of the Indian boy. He had added some wild flowers to the site, a tradition that began without thinking and was now part of his morning rituals. It was not a religious act, but something deeper. It was a quiet acknowledgement that this little life had changed the course of his own existence in ways he had not yet fully understood. In the third week after the encounter with the warriors, Edward noticed subtle movements in the distant hills. They were not soldiers this time. It was a single figure, small and familiar, moving among the rocks with the natural grace of one who belonged to that land long before the white men arrived with their fences and their laws. It was her. The bereaved mother had returned. Edward watched her descend the rocky slope with careful steps, her black hair now adorned with small white feathers that glistened in the light of the setting sun. She was not coming alone this time. 3 other women accompanied her, all carrying baskets woven with natural fibers. As they approached the grave, Edward understood that they had come for a more elaborate ceremony, a final farewell that would honor the boy's memory according to the traditions of his people. He observed them from afar, respecting the sacredness of the moment. The women arranged themselves around the grave in a perfect circle, their voices rising into ancestral chants that echoed through the rocks like the wails of wounded birds. They scattered wildflower petals, burned aromatic herbs that filled the air with sweet, earthy fragrances, and deposited small objects that shone like precious jewels in the golden evening light. When the ceremony was over, the boy's mother broke away from the group and walked towards Edward. She approached unhurriedly, her eyes no longer carrying only the pain of loss, but also something that could be peace. When she stopped before him, she held out her hands and offered a small, soft leather bag. Edward accepted it with reverence, feeling the weight of seeds or grains inside. Wordlessly, she pointed to the earth around the grave, and then to the bag. Edward understood immediately. They were seeds of sacred plants, flowers that would grow over her son's grave, transforming that place of pain into a garden of living memories. It was a gift that transcended cultures and languages, a symbol of hope springing from the land where sorrow had been planted. After the women departed, disappearing among the rocks like apparitions of twilight, Edward remained alone with his reflections. He planted the seeds with the same care with which he had dug the grave, watering them with precious water from his well and protecting them with small stones arranged in a circle. It was a meditative, almost ritual work that connected him not only with the memory of the dead boy, but with something bigger and older than any man-made frontier. The weeks turned into months, and Edward watched the first seedlings sprout from the red earth. They were vibrantly colored flowers he had never seen before, petals ranging from deep purple to golden yellow, creating a natural mosaic that transformed the gravesite into an oasis of beauty in the middle of the barren landscape. Birds began to visit the garden, and sometimes Edward saw small desert animals drinking the dew that accumulated on the petals during the cool nights. Macready returned 3 times during this period, always accompanied by his soldiers, always looking for evidence that could incriminate him. But Edward had become a master of the art of patience, receiving hostile visitors with the same cold courtesy he reserved for unwanted peddlers. He showed his property when asked, answered questions with polite monosyllables, and waited for the lawman to leave to continue his simple life. During one of these visits, Macready noticed the garden blooming over the grave. His eyes narrowed with suspicion when he saw the exotic flowers, so different from the native vegetation of the region. Edward calmly explained that he had found the seeds during one of his horseback rides, and decided to plant them in memory of a pet he had lost. It wasn't exactly a lie, he thought, just one version of the truth that Macready could accept without questioning his authority. The sheriff walked around the garden like a vulture encircling a carcass, but found nothing he could use against Edward. The flowers were just flowers. The grave was just a mound of earth where a lonely man had chosen to bury his memories. Macready left that day with frustration on his face, and Edward knew instinctively that he wouldn't see him again anytime soon. As the first year went on, the garden transformed into something truly extraordinary. The flowers had spread naturally, creating a colorful carpet that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds from distant places. Edward built a small wooden bench where he could sit in the afternoons, contemplating the beauty that had sprung from a simple act of compassion. During one of these afternoons of contemplation, Edward heard the familiar sound of hooves approaching. But this time they were not soldiers. It was a small group of indigenous knights, led by the same chief who had received his amulet months ago. They stopped at a respectful distance and dismounted, their expressions solemn but not threatening. The chief approached the garden and knelt before the flowers, muttering words in his ancestral language. When he got up, he looked at Edward with eyes that shone with pent-up emotion. He took out of his leather bag a second amulet, this one carved from green jade and depicting a tree with deep roots. It was a symbol of eternal life, of growth that transcends death, of legacies that are perpetuated through the generations. Edward accepted the gift with the gravity that the moment demanded. The chief then placed both hands on his shoulders and spoke a few words that Edward did not understand, but whose meaning came to him through channels deeper than language. It was a blessing, a spiritual adoption, an acknowledgement that he had become part of something bigger than his own solitary existence. After the visitors left, Edward remained seated on his bench until the stars began to appear in the darkened sky. He thought of the extraordinary journey that had begun with a simple act of kindness to a grieving mother. She thought of the boy she had never met, but whose death had become the catalyst for her own transformation. He thought of the warriors who might have been his enemies, but who chose to see him as a brother. That night, for the first time in decades, Edward did not feel alone. The garden around him pulsed with life. The flowers exuded perfumes that carried stories of distant lands, and the wind whispered ancient secrets among the colorful petals. He had planted seeds of compassion in arid soil and reaped a harvest of belonging that would last the rest of his life. Years later, when other settlers occasionally passed by his property, they would talk in wonder about the magical garden that flourished in the middle of the desert. Some tried to get seeds to plant on their own land, but the flowers never grew the same way elsewhere. Edward knew why. Those plants were not just flowers. They were living symbols of a truth that few men are privileged to discover. That compassion, when planted in the fertile soil of genuine humanity, always bears fruit that nourishes not only those who cultivate them, but all those who have the wisdom to recognize their beauty. And so Edward learned that some gestures, born of the purest kindness, create waves that spread far beyond the moment they were performed, touching lives, changing destinies, and planting gardens of hope in places where before only the desert of human indifference existed. If this story of courage and redemption touched your soul, you can't miss the next epic adventures that took place in the wild lands of the American Wild West, where men faced impossible choices between the law of men and the codes of the heart, where simple acts of compassion turned into eternal legacies that changed destinies forever, and where every dawn brought the possibility of encounters that would define the character of a lifetime. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of these gripping narratives that reveal the true spirit of the American frontier.